Imagine a world where democracy was born in blood and debate, where philosophers questioned everything we thought we knew, where warriors fought naked, poets changed civilization, and a handful of city-states stood against the greatest empire the world had ever seen. This is not mythology, this is history. Welcome to ancient Greece, the civilization that gave us philosophy, democracy, theater, and the Olympic Games. But here's what they don't teach you in school. The Greeks were far stranger, more brutal, and infinitely more fascinating than the marble statues and temple ruins suggest. Today, we're diving deep into 3,000 years of triumph, tragedy, and transformation. From the ashes of the Bronze Age to the conquests of Alexander the Great, this is the complete story of how a collection of quarreling city-states became the foundation of Western civilization. But be warned, this isn't the sanitized version. This is the real ancient Greece. Let's begin. Our story begins not with glory, but with collapse. Around 1200 BC, the Bronze Age Mediterranean was thriving. The Mycenaean Greeks, yes, the people of Homer's epics, controlled fortress cities across the Greek mainland. They traded with Egypt, fought at Troy, and recorded their transactions on clay tablets in a script called Linear B. Then everything went dark. Within a century, nearly every major city in the eastern Mediterranean was destroyed. Mycenaean palaces burned, trade networks collapsed, literacy vanished. Populations plummeted by up to 90% in some regions. Archaeologists call this the Bronze Age collapse, and it remains one of history's greatest mysteries. For Greece, this catastrophe ushered in the Dark Age. For centuries where we have almost no written records, cities were abandoned. The art of writing was forgotten. The great Mycenaean kingdoms dissolved into scattered villages and roaming tribes. But from this darkness, something extraordinary emerged. Around 800 BC, Greece began to awaken. The population grew. Trade resumed with Phoenicia and the Near East. And most critically, the Greeks adopted and modified the Phoenician alphabet, creating a writing system that could capture not just inventories and accounts, but ideas, stories, and poetry. This is when Homer, or whoever Homer was, composed the Iliad and the Odyssey. These weren't just entertainment. They were instruction manuals for how to be Greek. They taught values, honor, glory, hospitality, cunning. They created a shared cultural identity across hundreds of independent communities. Because here's the crucial thing to understand. There was never a unified, ancient Greece, as a country. Instead, Greece was a patchwork of city-states, called polis, each fiercely independent, often at war with each other, but bound by common language, religion, and culture. The two most powerful? Athens and Sparta. And they couldn't have been more different. Let's talk about Sparta first, because nothing, and I mean nothing, in history quite compares to this place. Sparta wasn't just a military society. It was a military cult that happened to call itself a city-state. Here's how extreme it was. When a Spartan boy was born, he was inspected by elders. If he appeared weak or deformed, he was taken to a mountain chasm and left to die. If he passed inspection, he belonged to his mother, until age 7. At 7, the boy was taken from his family and entered the agoge, the notorious Spartan training system. For the next 13 years, he would be brutalized, starved, and trained to kill. Boys were deliberately underfed and encouraged to steal food. But if caught, they were whipped, not for stealing, but for getting caught. They slept on beds of reeds they gathered themselves. They went barefoot year-round. They were beaten regularly to build pain tolerance. At age 12, they were sent into the wilderness for a year-long test called the Cryptiae, where they were expected to survive by stealing from the enslaved population called helots, and to kill any helot they encountered at night. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake. This was calculated. Sparta was surrounded by enemies and sat atop a massive enslaved population that outnumbered citizens 7 to 1. They needed soldiers who were absolutely fearless and utterly obedient. And it worked. Spartan warriors were the most feared soldiers in Greece. They fought in a formation called the phalanx, a wall of shields and spears where discipline mattered more than individual skill. In battle, Spartans advanced slowly, singing hymns, their red cloaks flowing. When other armies saw that red tide approaching, they often fled before contact. But here's what's fascinating. Spartan women had rights that would shock other Greeks. They owned property. They exercised publicly. They were educated. They managed estates while men were at war. One Spartan woman, asked why Spartan women were the only ones who could rule men, replied. Because we are the only ones who give birth to men. Yet for all their military might, Sparta produced no philosophy, no great literature, no scientific advancement. They built no magnificent temples. Their entire society was optimized for one thing, war. And that single-minded focus would ultimately limit them. Now let's turn to their opposite, Athens. If Sparta was the sword of Greece, Athens was its mind. But Athens didn't start as a democracy. Like most Greek city-states, it began as a kingdom, evolved into an aristocracy, and by the 7th century BC was tearing itself apart with class conflict. The rich were getting richer. The poor were becoming debt's slaves. Civil war loomed. Enter Solon in 594 BC, a poet and statesman who was given emergency powers to save Athens. His reforms were revolutionary. He cancelled debts, freed debt's slaves, and created a new constitution based on wealth rather than birth. Not perfect, but progress. The real breakthrough came in 508 BC with Cleisthenes, who established democratia. Rule by the people. Not rule by all people, mind you. Women, slaves, and foreigners couldn't vote, but for male citizens, this was unprecedented. Here's how radical Athenian democracy was. Most officials were chosen by lottery, not election. Why? Because elections favor the wealthy and charismatic. Random selection meant any citizen could end up running the city. It was direct democracy. Citizens voted on laws themselves, not through representatives. The central institution was the assembly, which met 40 times a year on a hill called the Nix. Any citizen could speak. Any citizen could propose a law. 6,000 citizens constituted a quorum for major decisions. Was it perfect? Absolutely not. It excluded the majority of residents. It could be swayed by demagogues. It sentenced Socrates to death. But it was something the world had never seen. Government by debate rather than decree. And this freedom of thought transformed Athens into an intellectual supernova. Playwrights like Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides invented drama and used it to explore human nature, morality, and the relationship between gods and mortals. Thousands gathered in open-air theaters to watch tragedies that still resonate today. Philosophers like Socrates wandered the marketplace, questioning assumptions and irritating the powerful. His student Plato founded the academy, and Plato's student Aristotle tutored Alexander the Great and wrote foundational works on ethics, politics, biology, and logic. Historians like Herodotus and Thucydides invented history as we know it, not as myth or propaganda, but as inquiry into what actually happened and why. Athens became a magnet for talent across the Greek world. Sculptors like Phidias created masterpieces. Architects designed the Parthenon, still standing today, still breathtaking. Scientists like Hippocrates established medicine as a rational discipline rather than magic. But this golden age was built on shaky foundations. Silver mines worked by slaves, tribute extracted from subject cities, and growing tension with Sparta. A collision was inevitable. Before Athens and Sparta destroyed each other, they faced a common enemy that made their rivalry seem petty: the Persian Empire. In 490 BC, the Persians, the largest empire the world had ever known, decided to punish Athens for supporting a Greek revolt in Asia Minor. King Darius sent a fleet across the Aegean carrying thousands of soldiers. They landed at Marathon, about 26 miles from Athens. The Athenians had a choice: wait for help from Sparta or fight immediately with their 10,000 citizen soldiers against perhaps 25,000 Persians. They chose to fight. The Battle of Marathon was a gamble. The Athenian general Miltiades strengthened his flanks and deliberately weakened his center. When the armies clashed, the Persian center pushed forward. Then the Greek flanks collapsed inward, surrounding them. It was a slaughter. Athens lost 192 men. The Persians lost over 6,000. Legend says a messenger named Phidippides ran the 26 miles back to Athens to announce victory, shouted, "We won!" and died of exhaustion. That's where we get the marathon race. Though the story is probably myth. But the Persians weren't finished. They would return. 10 years later, in 480 BC, Darius's son Xerxes assembled the largest military force ever seen. Estimates range from 100,000 to over 200,000 soldiers and 600 warships. This wasn't a punitive expedition. This was conquest. The Greek city-states, for once, united. Sparta would lead on land. Athens would lead at sea. At Thermopylae, the hot gates, a narrow pass between mountains and sea. King Leonidas of Sparta positioned 7,000 Greeks to hold back the Persian army. For 2 days they held. The Persian numbers meant nothing in the narrow pass. Every wave broke against the Greek shields. Then a Greek traitor showed the Persians a mountain path. Leonidas realized he was about to be surrounded. He sent most of the army away and stayed with 300 Spartans and about 1,000 other Greeks to buy time. They fought to the last man. Herodotus tells us they fought with swords, then spears, then teeth in hands when their weapons broke. Every single one died. But they bought Athens time to evacuate. The Persians burned Athens to the ground, but found it empty. The Athenian general Themistocles had convinced his city to abandon Athens and trust in their wooden walls, not the city walls, but their navy. The entire population evacuated to the island of Salamis. Xerxes, watching from a golden throne on a hillside, expected to witness his fleet crush the Greeks in the narrow straits of Salamis. Instead, he watched in horror as the Greeks, who knew every current and reef, systematically destroyed his navy. The Persian ships were larger but less maneuverable. In the confined waters, they collided with each other while Greek triremes rammed them and marines swarmed their decks. By sunset, 200 Persian ships were sunk. Xerxes fled back to Persia. The following year, at Plataea, the combined Greek forces destroyed what remained of the Persian army in Greece. Against impossible odds, Greece had survived. Western civilization, democracy, philosophy, rational inquiry, survived with it. The historian Victor Davis Hanson argues that Salamis is one of the most important battles in human history. If Persia had won, the intellectual tradition of questioning authority might have been strangled in its cradle. But the unity wouldn't last. After the Persian Wars, Athens entered its golden age under Pericles, a period of unmatched artistic and intellectual achievement. The Parthenon was built, democracy was perfected, the arts flourished. Athens became the school of Greece, as Pericles called it in his famous funeral oration. But Athens also became an empire. The defensive alliance against Persia, the Delian League, became an Athenian protection racket. Cities that tried to leave were crushed. The treasury was moved from Delos to Athens. Democracy at home was funded by imperialism abroad. Sparta watched with growing alarm. Athens was becoming too powerful, too arrogant. In 431 BC, war exploded. The Peloponnesian War, which would last 27 years and drain Greece of its power and idealism. Sparta had the better army. Athens had the better navy and could supply itself by sea. Neither could deliver a knockout blow. The war became a grinding stalemate punctuated by massacres and betrayals. Athens committed atrocities. When the island of Melos refused to join Athens, the Athenians killed all the men and enslaved the women and children. The historian Thucydides recorded the Melian dialogue, where Athenian envoys bluntly stated, "The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must." So much for democracy and justice. Athens launched a massive invasion of Sicily in 415 BC, a gamble to conquer Syracuse and fund the war. It was a catastrophe. Nearly the entire Athenian fleet and army was destroyed. Thousands of Athenians died in Syracusan quarries, starving and sunburnt. Sparta, funded by Persia, yes, the Persians, built a navy and strangled Athenian supply lines. In 404 BC, Athens surrendered. Its walls were torn down to the music of flutes. Its empire was dissolved. Its golden age was over. Greece had defeated the greatest empire in the world, only to commit suicide fighting itself. The 4th century BC saw brief Spartan dominance, then Theban dominance, then chaos. The city-states were exhausted, bankrupt, depopulated. Greek civilization seemed to be eating itself. Then from the north came a king who would change everything. The Greeks considered Macedonians barely Greek, hillbilly cousins who spoke Greek with a thick accent and had kings instead of proper city-states. Then Philip II became king in 359 BC and revolutionized warfare. Philip created the first professional standing army in Europe. He invented the sarissa, a 20-foot pike that turned the Macedonian phalanx into an unstoppable battering ram. He combined infantry, cavalry, and siege engines in coordinated combined arms tactics that were centuries ahead of their time. City by city, he conquered Greece. When Athens and Thebes finally united against him, Philip crushed them at Chaeronea in 338 BC. Greece was his. He planned to invade Persia next, to avenge the Persian invasion of 480 BC. But in 336 BC, at his daughter's wedding, Philip was assassinated by his own bodyguard. His son Alexander was 20 years old. What Alexander accomplished in the next 13 years defies belief. He invaded Persia with 40,000 men and conquered the largest empire on earth. He never lost a battle. He marched from Greece to Egypt to Afghanistan to India, covering over 22,000 miles. At the Battle of Issus in 333 BC, he defeated Darius III despite being outnumbered 3-1. At Gaugamela in 331 BC, facing perhaps 100,000 Persians, Alexander identified a gap in the enemy line, charged directly at Darius, and broke the Persian army through sheer audacity. He founded over 20 cities, most named Alexandria. He spread Greek culture, language, and ideas from the Mediterranean to Central Asia. He married a Persian princess and encouraged his soldiers to do the same, attempting to fuse Greek and Persian cultures into something new. But Alexander was also ruthless. He destroyed Thebes so thoroughly that it ceased to exist. He executed men who disagreed with him. He claimed to be a god and expected worship. In 323 BC, in Babylon, at age 32, Alexander died, possibly of fever, possibly of poison. When asked who should succeed him, he allegedly replied, "The strongest." His empire immediately shattered into warring kingdoms ruled by his generals: Ptolemaic Egypt, Seleucid, Persia, Antigone and Macedon. These Hellenistic kingdoms would last for centuries, spreading Greek culture across the known world. The age of the independent city-state was over. The age of empires had begun. If you made it this far, you're clearly a history lover like me. Subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss our next documentary. What lost civilization should we explore next? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching.